Plugin Power 1 features the plugin capabilities of Lightwave 3D with Macroform, Particle Storm, and Wave Filter. NewTek's own Brad Peebler shows you how to quickly master the natural modeling qualities of Macroform's rail tools and productivity toolsets. Learn to create complex organic models using simple spline shapes. Use precision scaling and alignment tools to speed your modeling productivity. With Particle Storm, learn how to create cascading water, roaring fire, and showers of sparks. See how to control density, gravity, collision, lifespan, and other characteristics to give your animation lifelike qualities with this incisive particle system package. Learn how to selectively apply filters to Lightwave imagery with Wave Filter. Colorize, posterize, blur, color filter effects, and more. Discover Wave Filter's unique mixing board interface that enables you to animate any of these effects over time. Master these powerful plugins with Plugin Power 1. Learn to quickly create light beams, variable density fog, dust, and smoke with Lightwave Steamer, the powerful pixel filter and particle displacement map plugin. This in-depth view of Steamer shows you how to master its powerful controls. Create ray-traced light beams. Add atmospheric simulation with variable density clouds and fog. Discover how to use Steamer with objects to create dust clouds, billowing steam, and animated smoke trails. Learn to master Steamer's attributes and settings for speed and efficiency. Organic modeling and animation takes you through essential steps for creating realistic creature animation. Learn powerful modeling techniques to quickly model your creature from a simple sketch. Digital artist David Lombardi demonstrates modeling techniques for optimum animations. Learn the capabilities of Puppet Master for natural body movement. Add facial expression using multiple morph targets, controlled with Lightwave's Morph Gizmo. Then create the walk sequence, incorporating Lightwave's inverse kinematics capabilities. Discover how to set up and combine these features for maximum effect and realism. All this and more, available now from Desktop Images.
Dear video professional, the elements of this videotape represent the work of creative professionals like yourself. Unauthorized duplication of this tape not only is a federal crime, but also contributes to the destruction of an industry that you helped create. Please do your part by not duplicating this videotape. Thank you.
A special note for Macintosh users. For any functions mentioned using the right mouse button, hold down the Apple key and click the mouse. Are you suffering from unwelcomed house guests? Are flies vomiting on your food? Finding roaches in your shoes? Then get new Bug Off. You try to get rid of them, but sprays don't work. Aerosols make you gag. Only Bug Off employs an exclusive miniaturized weapons system to seek out and eliminate household pests with surgical precision. Bug Off comes complete with sub-miniature projectile laser-assisted technology that kills bugs on contact. No roach motels here. Pesky ants just can't hide from Bug Off's maximized environment shielding system. And those annoying flies. They're just no match for Bug Off's flying insect roaming eliminator. %50 stronger than sprays. So get Bug Off today.
Hi, I'm Don Balance. This is the first in a series of tapes designed to walk you through the creation of a Lightwave production. The series will start out with the basics of Lightwave and then walk you through to the more advanced techniques. Whether you're a beginning user in Lightwave or an experienced user, I think this series will offer you new tools to take advantage of Lightwave. In this tape, we're going to look at the basics of the modeler and it's going to pick up basically where the quick start tape left off. We're going to learn how to model several different types of objects, and each new object that we model will reveal new tools and new techniques in the creation of objects in the modeler. This production is being done on an alpha-based workstation running at 500 megahertz by Digital Equipment Corporation. The machine has 128 megs of RAM and a PowerStorm OpenGL card in it. Let's go ahead and take a look. Let's go ahead and set the modeler up to optimize our time spent in the modeler. The first thing that I can do is I can configure my views. We have 3 views that we work in, the top view, the face view, and the left view. Let me go ahead and load up an object. And I'll hit the A key to fit it into all 3 windows. And I can see my object from the top, from the face, and from the left or the side. Now, I can grab the crosshairs of these windows, and I can expand any view to full screen, or I can just look at 2 of the windows. Or I can basically move this around and set it any way that I want. I can set these views up so that I can get to them with the click of 1 key on the keyboard. And I use the numeric keypad to set this up. I want to make sure that number lock is turned on. And I think of the screen as my keypad. The screen in this view right here is right in the center. So I'm going to use the number 5 right in the center of my keypad. So I hold down the control key and I hit the number 5, and it brings up my save view parameters. Now there are a lot of parameters here, and I only have 2 of them checked. Let's take a look at what some of these variables do. Center will automatically recenter the view to wherever it is centered when you set the view up. I don't want to have this on because if I'm working on a specific portion of an object and then I want to change my view, I don't want it to snap back to the center of that object, and I'm going to have to go ahead and move back out to the portion I was working on. So I'm going to keep center turned off. The same with zoom factor. If I'm zoomed way in on an object and then I want to change my view, I don't want to be zoomed way back out and have to manually zoom back in again. I want it to stay where I had it set, so I turn zoom factor off. The same with foreground and background layers. If I set my views up with layer number 1 active, and then I'm working on an object in layer number 6 and I go to change my view, it'll snap back to layer number 1. I don't want that to happen either, so I'll turn foreground and background off. Visibility allows me to see points, curves, faces, and patch polygons. I'm going to leave that on. Orientation would snap the object to whatever orientation it was in when I set that view up. Again, I don't want that to happen. And preview type is how I'm displaying the object in my preview window. If I'm working in wireframe, I don't want to change a view and have it snap back to OpenGL. So I will keep preview type off as well. The only things I'm keeping on are quad shape and visibility, and I'll click OK. Now I'll grab the crosshairs with the left mouse and I'll drag it down so that the top view is full screen. Now the top view was in the upper left-hand corner, so I'll use the number 7, the upper left-hand corner of my keypad. And you'll notice that the variables stay the way they were for the last setting that I had made. So we'll go ahead and set that. Now I'll drag it up so that the face view is full screen. For this, we'll use number 1, lower left-hand corner. We'll drag the left view to full screen. That's my lower right corner, so number 3. And then my preview would be number 9 for the upper right-hand corner. Now when I hit the number 5, my view automatically snaps back to the quad view, and I can look at the top view with number 7, the face view with number 1, the left view with number 3, the preview with number 9. Now, I have 4 numbers that I haven't used here, and I can set up variables for those too. One of my favorites is being able to turn on and off patch polygons. Now, patch polygons are used with MetaNurbs, and I'm going to jump ahead of myself a little bit here, but I just want to explain to you how to turn this feature on and off using a keyboard shortcut. MetaNurbs are engaged by turning on the tab key. So let me load up a very simple object. I'll make a box. And when I turn on MetaNurbs by hitting the tab key, it smooths and rounds the object for me. Now this is what it looks like with patch polygons turned off. If I hit the D key to go into the display panel, I can turn patch polygons on by checking that box. When I do, I can now see the polygons that make up the object. Now, it doesn't look too bad on a basic object like this, but when I get a very complex object, sometimes the patch polygons and the actual NURBS polys start to get close together, and it gets kind of confusing. But there are those times when I do want to see them. So I want to set it up so I can turn them on with one keyboard shortcut. Well, they're on right now, So I'm going to hit Control 8, being a number that I haven't used yet, and I'm going to turn quad shape off because I don't want it to snap back to this 4 quad view every time. If I'm in the top view, I want to be able to turn patch polygons on and off without it snapping back there. Now, all I have is visibility, and visibility allows me to see the patch polygons. So now if I hit the number 5, it turns them off, and the number 8 turns them on. And it doesn't matter even if I'm in the top view. Number 8 turns them on, and the number 7 turns them off because all of the views that I set up originally had the patch polygons turned off. So the 8 is just a way of turning them on, and then going back to the button that gets you to that view turns them back off again. Let's take a look at that display panel again. There are a couple things in here you want to make sure are set up properly. You want to make sure that the grid snap is set to standard. This comes in handy when you're going to be mirroring objects, and I want to get an object centered up on an axis. With the grid snap turned on, I can very easily snap this object to an axis. If the grid snap is turned off, it may appear to be lined up on the axis, but when I go to do a mirror to duplicate from one side of an axis to another, I may end up with a seam or a gap between those two objects because it was just maybe nanometers away from that axis. If I make sure the grid snap is turned on, I'll make sure that I can snap to those axes every time. I can also go to a standard or a fixed grid snap and type in how big I want the grid snap to be. Right now it's set to 1 millimeter, and that works fine for me most of the time. There are also times when I do want to turn that grid snap off because I want to move a point less than 1 millimeter, so I can come in and turn it off. And then I usually will come back in and turn it right back on again. I can also set my default unit. Whenever I'm going to do something numerically, it defaults to meters because I have the default unit set to meters. I can now set this to millimeters, microns, nanometers, kilometers. I do a lot of work in millimeters, so I might set it to millimeters, and instead of having to type in 10 mm every time, I can just type in 10 and hit enter, and it automatically defaults to millimeters for me. I'm going to leave it set for meters right now. This is also where I can set up an input device like a Wacom tablet other than a mouse, and I can change my unit system from scientific to metric to English. Most of the time I work in scientific, but there are those times where I really can't do those conversions in my head. I'm really not that good with math, so I may want to bump over to English and say I want this thing to be 3 feet long. Then I can just go back to scientific and continue to work at that point. We can also set up the way that the views are presented to us using these preferences right here. 98% of the time that I work in Modeler, I work in the quad logo XY view. You can play with some of the other views. They're just different variables and different setups of the way the screen looks. Our preview type is set up in this menu, and it defaults to OpenGL Smooth Shaded, but there are several different ways we can look at objects. Let me go ahead and load up an object again. Load up that same chair. Right now, this is the Smooth OpenGL preview. We can look at the flat shaded OpenGL preview, and this shows me the polygons. You can see the polygons going around the edge of the seat now. This view comes in handy when I actually want to be able to see the polygons that I'm manipulating. We also have the OpenGL sketch view, and this shows me kind of a ghosted image of the object. Not true OpenGL, but I can see all of the polygons outlined on it. We also have the solid view, which shows me a solid view of the chair, and I can manipulate and move the chair around. We have the front face view, which only shows me the front face polygons. When I stop and let go, it doesn't show me any of the polygons that are back behind. As I move it, I can see those polygons behind it, but when I let go, I only see the polygons that are facing the camera. We also have the wire view, and the wire view comes in handy. I can't move the object around, but I can select points and polygons now from this view. So let's say I'm in the front face view, and I move the chair like this, and I can see this point on the upper back support of the chair. Now if I go to the wire view, in this view I can actually select that point. I'll go to Points and click on it, and I now have selected just that one point. Just an alternate way of selecting points and polygons. And last but not least, we have none if I don't want to have a preview at all. Again, probably 95% of the time, I work in OpenGL Smooth Shaded. I want to go to the Options panel. This can be reached either by clicking on the Options button under the Objects menu or just by hitting the O on the keyboard. This brings me my data options. This is where I can set what I want my current surface to be called as I create it. Well, default works pretty well for that. I really haven't found a reason to change that. This is also how I can set up how my polygons are going to be created. Are they going to be created as triangles, quadrangles, or automatically created as triangles or quadrangles? Lightwave, for the most part, likes to work in quadrangles as much as possible, so I set it to quads. I can always triple them to make them triangles later. I can also set up my curve division. This comes in handy when I'm creating splines, and a spline is nothing but a curve with points on it. Well, when I create that curve, coarse gives me the fewest number of points on the line, medium gives me more points in the line, and fine gives me the most number of points in that spline. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we create some splines. The patch division number is the number that Lightwave uses to create polygons on an object when we are working in MetaNurbs. But it also dictates what your OpenGL preview window is going to look like. So if I go ahead and just load up that box again, I'll just drag out a box, turn on MetaNurbs, we can see that it's kind of faceted around the edges here. If I hit the O key and go back into my data options and I change the patch division up to 6, I'm going to notice that it's smoothed out quite a bit and it looks nicer. So most of the time I work with my patch division set to 6 so that my OpenGL preview looks good. And then when I'm actually ready to freeze a MetaNurbed object, I may bring that number down. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we're actually modeling some things with MetaNurbs a little bit later. But when I first start modeling, I want to change that number to 6 so my OpenGL preview looks good. This is also where you can set up your number of undo levels to a maximum of 15. Lightwave defaults to 3 when you load it in. So if you're trying to do undos and you get to that 4th one and it won't work, this is where you need to come to set it up. Why don't we just set it to 15 as a default? Because each time I set up an undo level, it takes a little bit of RAM. And if I'm working on a machine that's maybe a little low on RAM, I can bring that number down so I'm not using up all my RAM just to have undo buffers available to me. But with this machine, I have 128 megs of RAM in it, which is plenty, so I'll go ahead and set it to 15. And I'll click OK to close the panel. I want to make you aware that these are my own personal preferences. This is the way that I like the modeler to be set up, and everyone's a little bit different. That's why all those variables exist. But this is a good jumping off point for you. Start out with these settings, play with it, experiment with the different views, experiment with the different settings in the options panel and the display panel, and see what kind of results you get, and set it up so that it's the way that you like it to be when you're working in the modeler. You don't always have to create all of your objects from scratch. Lightwave, for instance, comes with a variety or library of objects ready to load. There are a variety of third-party objects available on the internet. There are CDs you can buy and different sources you can get for collecting objects or buying objects that you can use. Let's take a look at some of the objects that come with Lightwave. There are a couple of different ways to load objects into the modeler. I can either use my File pop-up menu here. Holding down the left mouse button over it, it allows me to clear the modeler, load objects, save objects as, save layers as, I'll cover that in a little bit, and get the About Lightwave Modeler, which can give me the version number, as well as quitting modeler altogether. Well, I'm going to go to Load Object, and it brings up the file requester to load an object. And whenever you're loading an object that comes with Lightwave, that will be found in the New Tech directory, in the Objects directory. And here I have a variety of directories full of objects that are categorized for you. If I click on the Animals directory, I get all of the animal objects that come with Lightwave. And for you current Lightwave users, you may notice there's a couple of new ones in there. As a matter of fact, with Lightwave 5.5, all of the content has been completely reworked and a lot of new content has been added. So if you haven't looked at the content directories for a while, you may want to take a gander at them, and you'll find a lot of neat new objects that you can not only use as themselves, but modify into new objects. I'm going to go ahead and load up an object by just clicking on it one time and clicking on Open. Or I can use the keyboard shortcut of L. This also brings up the Load Object requester. And instead of clicking on the object and clicking on Open, I can simply double-click on the object. This also loads the object. Once I get an object loaded in, again, I can use my different views to look at it. The top view, front view, left view, preview, all 4 windows. I can use the comma and period keys to zoom in and out. The period key zooms me in, the comma key zooms me out. I can also use the A keyboard shortcut. This will automatically fit the object into all 3 windows for me as best it can. I can use my OpenGL preview to spin this around in real time and look at my object from all the different angles. And this really works a lot like a trackball. If I start out at the top here and I pull down, it pulls over from the top, over from the side, it rotates from the side. From an angle, it comes down at an angle. I found when I first started working in Modeler or in Lightwave, I didn't even enter the modeler for a while to create my own objects, but there were a lot of times where I would come into the modeler and take the existing Lightwave objects and modify them into objects that I could use, basically cannibalizing the available content to make new objects that I could use for my animations. This is a great way to get started, and it's also a great way to look at the objects that come with Lightwave and see how they were built. This will give you an idea how to build your own objects. Let's go ahead and clear the cow out. What if I don't want to use one of the objects that comes with Lightwave? I want to create my own object. Well, we can do this several ways, and the first way is by using the primitive objects that come along with Lightwave. Right now, my views are still set so that you could see the cow in all 3 windows. And you may notice that each window has a crosshair. The crosshair is the pivot point of the object, or where the object is going to rotate from. Well, if I want to get these windows all reset, if I don't have any objects loaded into the modeler and I hit the A key, it resets my grid so that they're all now centered in all 3 screens. If I make a box object, which is one of my primitives, I can drag it out in one of the windows. I can then drag it out in one of the other windows, because right now it is 2-dimensional, it is flat. If I give it dimension in one of the second windows, I get the dimension in the third window automatically, and I've now created a template to make my box. I have not created the box yet. In order to create that box, I either have to click on the Make button, or, as you can see, the Return key is my keyboard shortcut, and the Enter key on the numeric keypad works as well. By hitting that, it actually makes the object. Here's my box, and in my OpenGL preview, I can spin it around and look at it. Now, as I was talking about before, I've got my crosshairs in all 3 windows centered somewhat on the object. Another little trick that I like to use is one of the plugins that comes with Lightwave. Under the Objects panel, there's a custom pop-up panel. And if I pop that up, one of my Lightwave plugins is called Center. By activating that, it will center the object on all 3 axes for me automatically. Now I know my object is completely centered, and you see as I rotate it around in the preview, it rotates around its center. But what if I wanted to rotate around one of its corners? Well, if I move the box by going to Modify, Move, and in my top view, I'm looking down from above here, I'm going to move it up so its corner rests at center axis. And in my face view, I'm going to set it up so that the corner rests on the center axis. Now, this corner is at 0, 0, 0, or the pivot point. So when I rotate the object, you'll see now that it rotates around that corner as its pivot point, or its center. This comes into play when you're creating objects. Where do I want my pivot point to be? Well, if I'm making the wing of a bird, I don't want the pivot point to be here in the center. I don't want to center the object, because then if I rotate it, it's going to rotate like this around that center point. I'm going to want the wing of a bird to have its pivot point back here. So when I rotate it, it rotates in this fashion. I can move the pivot point when I'm in layout as well, which we'll talk about later on in the next tape. But for right now, I want to make sure that my pivot points are set where I want them for rotation on the objects as I make them in the modeler. Okay, so let's clear this box out for now. And let's talk about actually creating our primitive objects. We have boxes, balls, discs, and cones. So if I grab the box tool, again, I can use the grid that's laid out for me to measure how big the object, the primitive object is that I'm making. If I look down here in the lower left-hand corner, I can see that my grid size is 500 millimeters, which means that each one of these squares equals 500 millimeters. If I want to make a 1 meter box, I can start out in this corner and drag down to this corner. And you'll notice that a box drags out from its upper left-hand corner when you start dragging it. And then down in this view, I'll drag it up 1 grid square above and 1 grid square below. Knowing that 500 millimeters is half of 1 meter, I'm 500 above, 500 below, and 500 each side. That gives me a 1 meter box. Now, after I create the object, you still see the template of the box that I just made. If I want to, I could go to another layer and make an identical box. I'm going to undo that, come back here. But if I've made my box and I'm done with the box tool and I want to get rid of that blue outline, I simply hit the space bar. Now I can see the box that I've created. Again, I could hit the A key to make it fit in all 3 windows. That may bring me in a little closer than I want to be, so I hit the comma key 1 time and I'm ready to start manipulating this box. Now, not only can I make boxes, but I can make a ball. The difference about the ball primitive tool is that it drags out from the center. So I'm going to put the cursor right on the crosshairs, and when I drag it out, it drags the ball out from the center. Another neat trick is, before I start dragging it out, if I hold down the control key, activate the ball tool, put the cursor in the center and hold down the control key, it now constrains me to a perfect circle. So I drag it out again. I've just made a flat disk. It's 2-dimensional at this point. Now I have to go ahead and grab it from the center and drag this up, and I can now complete the ball. This is the template for the ball again. Now with the ball tool, I can grab it from the side and adjust on just one axis, or I can grab it from the corner and I can adjust proportionally, or I can grab the crosshair here in the center and move the entire ball template to wherever I want it to be to create that object. When I'm ready to create the object, I hit the Enter key, and I can see the ball that I've created. Again, I hit the space bar to get rid of that template, and I'm ready to take off from that point. Another primitive object that I have is a disk. Now, when you're drawing out a disk, the first mouse move that you make will draw out the circumference of the disk, and it's just like a ball tool. It drags out from wherever the center is. But now, when I give it depth in one of the other windows, you'll see that it's not a ball down here because we are actually creating a disk object. A disk doesn't always have to be flat. When you think of a disk, you might think of a quarter or something along those lines, a small disk. But the disk tool can be elongated to make cylinders as well. We also have the cone tool. The cone tool also, on the first mouse click, you're dragging out the circumference of the bottom of the cone. And then with the second mouse drag in one of the other windows, you're dragging the cone's height out. And then Enter key makes it, and I now have my cone object. We also have a sketch tool, which allows me to sketch freehand shapes. And all it really makes is a spline. When I hit the Enter key, it makes a spline. As I was talking about earlier, you can see that the spline is nothing but a curved line with points on it. And if you look back at the options panel, this curve division decides how many points are going to be placed on that line. If at a later point I would want to add or remove points, I can select a point if I'm in the point mode, and I select a point, and I cut it either by clicking on the cut button or hitting the X button. The spline adjusts accordingly, so I can remove points. I can also add points by going to the polygon mode and making sure that the line is selected by knowing that it's highlighted. I can go to the polygon menu and click on Add Points. Now it gives me a little arrow on my cursor, and if I put the arrow on the spline and I click, I now have a new point there. I can now go back to the points mode, select that point, go to Modify Move, and again adjust the spline. So I can add and delete points on these splines as I see fit. The last primitive tool that we have is the text tool. The text tool allows me to, when I activate it, click in a window, and it gives me a cursor that looks like this. I have to have fonts loaded into the modeler in order to be able to start typing. And to load those fonts, I need to go into the numeric panel of the text tool. I can either click on numeric or hit the N on the keyboard. I can see here, this is my pop-up menu that shows me what fonts are available currently, and I have none. So what I need to do is add them. You can use any Type 1 or TrueType PostScript font in Lightwave. So if you've got a word processor or a desktop publisher that uses PostScript fonts, you can bring those right into the modeler and start typing words and making them into 3D objects. Let's go ahead and load a few of the fonts that come with Lightwave. I'm going to click on Add Type 1, and it brings up my Load Font Requester, although it usually takes me to the wrong directory the first time I go there. So I need to be able to navigate through the directories and get to where my fonts are. Well, a good thing is to always go back out to the NewTek directory, because everything that is involved with the modeler or layout is in the NewTek directory. So I can use my pop-up here, go to NewTek, and I'm looking for PS fonts. For you Macintosh users, the current version of Lightwave 5.0 now loads the resident Mac fonts as well. Now that I'm in my PS fonts directory, I'm going to double-click on the B&P graphics directory, and it should show me the fonts, but I don't see anything. Well, in Windows, it's looking for a fonts extension, and those extensions are not on these fonts. I just need to come down here and say I want to see all of the files in that directory, and there they are. So I'm going to load up 4 or 5 of these fonts. I'll load up this one, say I want to add another one. I'll load up this one, add another one. Now I can see all the fonts that I have loaded, and if I come back out to my requester, I can type in some text. I can size it by using this, the top of my cursor. I can move it by using the bottom. I can also scroll through my text. But one thing I didn't tell you is a gotcha that I started to run into when I started to use the text tool, and that is, in the numeric panel, it also shows me the size of my text. The size of my text right now is 580 millimeters, but my grid size is 200 millimeters. So when I look at that text cursor, it is filling 580 millimeters worth. In that numeric panel, if this number is real big, let's say this number is 3 meters, now my cursor is so big that I can't ever grab the top of it. Okay, I can't zoom in and zoom out very effectively. Every time I try and use one of my keyboard equivalents, it's typing that in. One thing you can do is every time you hit the escape key, it allows you one keyboard equivalent. So I can sit here and hit the escape key over and over and over until I can finally see it, then size it down, and then zoom back in. But a better way of doing it is to go to the numeric panel, look at my grid size. I see it's 500 millimeters. Well, I'll make the size of my font 500 millimeters. And now I know that my cursor is going to fill 1 grid square on my screen. And I can start typing, manipulating, moving it around, creating my text by hitting Enter. And I've got my jumping off point to make my text object. One thing to remember when you're modeling is to be able to use the views to your advantage. You have to be able to kind of think in 3D to be able to do this. You have to realize that you have a top view, you're looking down from above, a face view, you're looking straight onto the object, and a left-hand view. Another thing to remember is that these are just labels, top, face, and left. I could actually model an object so its face was in the top view. But these are labels that are left there for you to use as reference points just so you don't get confused. So when you're modeling something, make sure you're modeling the top view in the top view, face view in the face view, and the left view in the left view. Let me go ahead and load up an object that comes with Lightwave to show you how I might use these views to my advantage. I load up the cow object and I want to start modifying it. Well, first I'm going to hit the A key. Again, this auto fits me into all 3 views. I can spin it around and look at my object. Now I can decide I want to make some modifications. I want to make the horns of the cow a little bit longer. Well, I want to select some of the points at the tips of the horns. I could select these points at the tips of the horns. I can't really do it in this view very well, but I can do it in this view real well. So I'm going to hit the number 3 key to blow that view up, and the period a couple of times to zoom in, and now I can see this area. Another way of zooming in on a specific area is putting the cursor over that area and hitting the G key. This will center that area in the view. And then by using the period key, when I zoom in specifically on that area that I wanted to highlight. I can now go in and select some points. Now, we have to remember that in this view, I'm not only selecting the points on this horn, but also on the ones that are behind it. So I'm going to hit the number 5 key, and then the A key. And I can see in the top view that, yes, when I selected in this view, I selected straight through and ended up also selecting the points on the other side. But that's okay, because I wanted to modify both horns at the same time. If I didn't want to modify this horn, at this point I could simply deselect those points and I'm only modifying the one horn. Then I can use my move tool. The keyboard shortcut for move is T, and I can drag those horns out and make them a little bit longer. Again, depending upon what I want to modify, maybe I want to make the front feet longer. Well, I could select the front feet in this left-hand view again, so I could blow it up and select just the front feet. Or maybe I want to select all the feet. So for that, maybe I want to go this view, and I want to do my lasso around this way to select all of the feet. When I go back, you can see now that all of the feet are selected, because not only did I select these, but also the ones that were behind them. So just remember that you do have 3 views that you can work in, and remember to use those views to your advantage. It really makes it a lot easier to orient yourself in the 3D environment and think in 3D. Let's go ahead and get rid of this object. Hit the A key to reset our grid. Another trick that I like to use a lot is, as I showed you before, when I was making the ball, I could hold down the control key and it would constrain it to a circle for me. Well, I can also do that when I'm manipulating points and polygons. If I drag out a box, and I'm going to add some segments to this box by using my arrow keys. I'll move the cursor up to the other window to add some segments to the top view, and I'll create it. Here's my box. Let's say I want to move these points right here along the top of the box straight up. Well, if I lasso them to select them, and then I hit T for move, if I just try and move them straight up, I can move them from side to side as well, so I may end up skewing them just a little bit. And that is not moved straight up. I'm going to have this seam right here. I'll hit U for undo. If I hold down the control key before I start to make the move, though, it will constrain me to an axis. Now, it doesn't actually constrain me. I can actually move to the left and the right, but as you'll see, it's a much bigger grid snap. And what the control key is doing in this instance is actually creating a much larger grid snap for me as long as I'm holding the control key down. So I can very easily move along one axis. I could move to another axis, but I'd have to make a very dramatic move. It also depends where the cursor is and the effect that that tool is going to have on the object. And what I mean by that is, I'll draw out another box. I'll make it. And if I'm going to use one of my modification tools, I have several modification tools, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But let's say I want to do a move, a rotate, a size, a stretch. Now, move doesn't really make that big of a difference. If I put the cursor over here, it moves the whole object. Now, rotate, it makes a big difference. If I rotate the object with the cursor in the center of the object, it rotates around its center. But if I rotate the object with the cursor on the upper corner, it rotates around that corner. So the positioning of that cursor makes a big difference on how that tool is going to affect that object. And it's the same with things like stretching. If I stretch an object with the cursor right in the center, I can stretch it equally on both these axes. But if I put it out here, when I do a stretch, it stretches more on these polygons than it does on these polygons that are closer to the cursor. So it's a way to stretch towards an orientation. What if I want to stretch the box towards this corner? Well, I can put the cursor up here, and when I do my stretch, the whole box stretches towards that corner. Now that we know how to create primitive objects, let's go ahead and take a look at some of our modification tools so we can modify them into new shapes. I'll take a primitive object like a box, drag it out, and I'll make it. Now, because I drug it out and didn't make it numerically, it is not perfectly centered on all 3 axes. And a lot of times, I want to be able to use these crosshairs as the center axis on my object. So I'm going to use that plugin again, Objects Custom, called LW Center. And this centers my object in all 3 axes for me automatically. Now I know that I can use these crosshairs and I will be dealing with the center of the object on all 3 axes. Modify tools are under the Modify menu, and they start out with Move, Rotate, Size, Stretch, and Drag. Move allows me to move the object, and again, depending upon which window the cursor is in, how it's going to move. I can move in 2 axes per window. This one in the Z and the X, I cannot move up and down. This one in the X and the Y, and this one in the Z and the Y. I can rotate, as I just described, either by putting the cursor in the center and rotating, or rotating just the object itself. But you have to realize that Everything that I'm doing to an object I can also do to a set of points or a set of polygons. If I select, again, this top row of points here, and I go to the rotate tool, I can put the cursor over here and I'm going to rotate that whole row of points from that area, from this as my rotational axis, which gives me a nice little sloped roof here. Let me go ahead and undo that. I could also rotate from the center and rotate this row of points from the center. So not only can I modify an entire object, but any portion of that object by selecting a series of points or polygons all the way down to 1 point or 1 polygon. Let's go ahead and deselect them by clicking on points in the gray area. I can size an object. Now, sizing an object sizes it on all 3 axes at the same time. And it does size according to where the cursor is. So again, if I want to size it proportionally, put it right in the center and size the object. Stretching is like sizing, except it allows me to size on just 1 axis instead of all 3 axes at the same time. Dragging is one of the only modes where I don't have to physically select points before I modify them. The drag tool enables me to place the cursor over top of existing points. Now again, you have to think in 3D, and when I'm in this view and I put the cursor over this point, it's going down the whole row of points because I'm looking down from the top. It goes down that corner of the box. By hitting the left mouse button, I can now drag that row of points around without having to select it first. Again, always remember you have 15 levels of undo, so you can undo a mistake. The shear tool is like an italicizing tool. This gets a little tricky sometimes when I use tools like shear and bend. I need to be able to think on what axis I need to grab the object to get the desired effect. As in shear, if I want to take this object in the face view and shear it this way, make its diagonal line coming up this way, I need to grab it on the top. So in essence, I'm grabbing the top of the box and pulling the top of the box over. And now I've sheared the box this way. You'll also notice that the shear goes right along with this curvature right here. And as we talked about in the quick start tape, I can change that to 4 different presets by using the up-down arrow keys. Or if I go into the numeric panel, I can adjust this curve by using these sliders. The bend tool, I'm going to go ahead and use my stretch tool, and I'm going to stretch this thing out a little bit. Hit the A key so we can see it. Actually, let's stretch it out this way because I'll end up with some more segments. That looks better. Now I want to bend this object. Well, if I'm going to bend an object, and this is the object, and I want to bend it up like this, if I'm looking down at the top view, I would grab it from here. Well, if I'm going to bend from the top view, it's going to try and bend the object around and up like this. That's not correct. Well, if I look at it from the face view, I'm looking at it from this view. And if I try and grab that object, it's going to try and bend it, again, the wrong way. I want to grab it from its end. I want to look at it from the side, and I want to grab it from right here. Not from the top and not from the front. The top bends it this way. The front bends it up this way. But the side allows me to bend it this way. And this is what I'm trying to accomplish. So I look at the side view here. I activate my bend tool, and this allows me to bend the object up. Now again, I can skew it either way, so if I undo that, if I hold the control key down first, now I can bend it straight up and all the way over into a 90-degree bend without going off axis in any other window. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. We also have the magnet, the vortex, and the pole tools. These are more advanced tools, which will probably be discussed in the later, more advanced modeling tapes. But one of my favorite new tools is the dragnet tool. And the dragnet tool is really a combination of the drag tool and the magnet tool. And what it allows me to do is it allows me to not just drag points by putting the cursor over them and dragging them, but with the right mouse button, showing an area of influence. So I want to influence all of these points, and then when I do the drag, they all kind of get drug out in a magnet format, giving you more control over the tool. Let's talk a little bit about surfacing in the modeler. I'm going to create a box with several segments on it and make it. Now let's say I want to surface this object, and I want to surface different parts of it with different surfaces. Well, I can select all of the polygons that make up the top of the box. Here, looking at my face view, looking at it from the front, there's all the polygons that make up the top of the box. And to get to surfaces, you can either go to Polygon, Surface, or hit the Q key for Quality Surfaces. And we find our surface panel in here. This is where I can change the surface. It comes in as default. So first thing I want to do is I want to give it a name, like top, so I know it's the top of the box, or maybe even top box. So I may have several objects that have tops. So now I know it's the top of the box. I can click on Pick Color, and I can assign it a color, perhaps this yellowish green color. And I can give it diffuse attributes. Now, diffusion is the amount of light that bounces back from an object. An object that is very diffuse, all the light bounces off of it. An object that is non-diffuse, like maybe a piece of charcoal, would absorb most of the light that comes to it. That would be very non-diffuse. A white piece of paper would be very diffuse. I can set specular level, which is the amount of shininess that the object has. I'm going to go ahead and turn that up to about 50%. Once I have specular activated, I can use glossiness, and glossiness changes the size of the hot spot. And I have presets of low, medium, high, and maximum, or I can go in and type in a number to get somewhere in between any of those presets. I'm going to go ahead and apply this, and when I apply it, you can see that the top half of the box now has that color. And it is specular. Doesn't show up too well on this box object, so let me go ahead and clear this out and use a ball. So I'll create my ball. I'll select the top polygons. We'll go to Surfaces, and we'll call it Top Ball. Again, let's give it some specularity, 50%. Glossiness at medium is fine. We'll give it a different color. Let's go with a dark blue this time. And you can now see that there is specular on it. The polygons highlight with the light source, but I can still see all the polygons. Well, I can get rid of those by going back to the Surfaces panel, Q for Quality Surfaces, and turn smoothing on. Smoothing is going to apply a picture of smooth. So it looks a lot smoother now than it did before, but if you look at the edges, you can still see the facets of the polygons on the edges. The only way to get rid of that is when I'm making the ball, go to a new layer here and make another ball. Before I create the ball, I go to numeric. And this tells me how many sides and how many segments the ball has. If I want it to be a much smoother ball, I simply increase the number. Let's go with 36 sides and 24 segments. Here's the same ball, but made out of a lot more polygons, so you can see that it is much smoother along the edges here. Why don't we just make everything out of as many polygons as we can? Because the more polygons you have, the longer it takes to render, the more RAM it takes up. How do I know when to use how many polygons? Practice. It's the kind of thing where if I'm going to make a ball and it's going to be a planet, if the planet is going to be off in the distance, it can almost look like a stop sign, and in layout, anti-aliasing will take care of that. It will smooth that out. But if I'm going to be orbiting that planet, I'm going to want it to have a lot of polygons in it. So when I'm coming over the top of the planet, it looks very smooth, unless I'm orbiting the planet stop sign. So let's go ahead back to our first layer. And I've got the top of the ball surfaced. Now I want to surface the bottom of the ball. So again, I can select those polygons. Go to Quality Surface. This we're going to call bottom. And let's give it a different color with the same attributes. And I will apply it. And now I've got the ball. What if I just want to have a stripe going through the ball? Well, I can select, let's select these two rows of polygons right here. And we'll go in, we'll call this stripe. Even though they were already surfaced as one surface, I'm now selecting them and redefining them as a new surface. You can change the surface at any time. So we'll call that stripe, and we'll give it yet another color, and apply it. So now I have a stripe in the center of the ball. And I can take this down to the polygon level. I can surface polygon by polygon throughout the entire object. It's very powerful. Any of the attributes that I apply to an object in the modeler will be transferred over to layout when I load them into layout to start creating an animation. Now, most of the time when I'm surfacing in the modeler, I want to give my surfaces labels. I want to say that this is going to be the stripe, and then give it a color just so I can see it, so I know that it looks right. But that's not what I'm going to leave it as. When I get over in the layout, I'm going to load up that stripe surface and actually surface it to make it look like I want it to. So this is a label or a template that I'm creating. I had a person ask me one time, they said, well, I went into the modeler, Don, and I labeled my object glass, and then when I rendered it out, it didn't look like glass. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. We're basically labeling the portion of the object that we're going to want to make look like glass. Then when we get into the layout, we can create that glass surface. Okay, when you go into the Surfaces panel, you're going to notice that you have two options down here. You have the Apply option and the Change option. The Apply option is going to apply whatever the current surface is right here to whatever polygons you have selected. But always remember, if nothing is selected, everything is selected. So if I hit Apply right now, it's going to apply that surface to the entire ball. Because nothing was selected, it thought everything was selected, so it applied that surface to the entire ball. Let me undo that. If I'm working with just the stripe and I change it, let's make it a different color. The stripe is not highlighted right now. I can't click Apply. It's going to apply that color to the whole ball. But I can click Change. Change is only going to change the surface of the polygons that already have this name, stripe. So I have to have the polygons labeled first. They have to be called stripe. But once I've got them labeled, if I want to make a change to them, I don't need to go in and highlight them. I can just click Change, and now I'm just changing the surface on just those polygons. Okay, before we go ahead and start making objects now, I'd like to show you a couple of shortcuts or tricks that I use that make my life a lot easier when I'm working in the modeler. The first one of these shortcuts is called Select Connected, and I use it all the time. The way it works is this. Let's say I make an object like a ball. Give it depth in this window, and I'll make it. And now I make another object that is attached to the ball. Like let's say I make a disc, and I have it sticking out of the top of the ball. When I create it, I now have this disc sticking out of the top of the ball, and so on. But then later on, I decide that I want to make changes to the ball by itself. But the ball and the disc are both in the same layer. So how do I get rid of one and keep the other? What I can do is I can go to the polygon mode, and I can just select some of the polygons of the ball. And then by using the close bracket key on the keyboard, it will select all the polygons that are connected to the polygons that I selected, hence selecting the entire ball. Now that it's selected, I can use Cut, go to a new layer, and use Paste to paste the ball in. Now I can make a modification on the ball. Maybe I wanted to size the ball but not the disc that was going through it. So now I can size the ball down a little bit and then bring it back to the original layer, and I still have the disc sticking out of it, enabling me to modify the ball without having to modify the disc. Select Connected. The next one of these is Invert Selection, and I find this to be useful when I'm working with text. So I'm going to go ahead and make a text object here real quick, and let's type out the word text. I make it. It's a two-dimensional object at this point. I want to go ahead and extrude it, so I'll go to the Multiply menu and use the Extrude tool. By clicking in the front face, Extrude will give me a handle in my top view. This is how far I'm going to extrude the object, and when I hit the Enter key, it makes a three-dimensional object for me. Now, what I want to do is I want to select just the front face polygons of the object and give them a surface. So I'll lasso those front polygons, go to the Surface panel, and we'll say Fronts, because it's the fronts of my text. And we'll give it some kind of color, just so that we know we have those polygons. And since it's selected, we can click Apply, and it will apply this surface to the fronts of the text. And we can see that the fronts of the text are now blue. Now I want to select everything else except the fronts. Well, instead of deselecting the fronts and trying to reselect everything, I can simply go to my Display menu, and under the Selection section, there's a button that says Invert. Well, if I click that, it's going to deselect any polygons that are selected and select anything that was not selected. So it's inverting my selection. It makes it very easy for me to surface one part of an object and then instantly select the other part and go ahead and surface that. So now I could go in and call this the sides. We could give that a different color. And again, it's selected, so I'll apply it. And now the sides of my text have a different color than the fronts of the text. Point polygon statistics is another interesting way of selecting points or polygons on an object. So let's say I have that same text object again. We'll go ahead and extrude it. So I have my 3D text object now, and I'm going to select the fronts like I did before, and we'll call them fronts. We'll go to surfaces and we'll call them fronts, and we'll apply it. Now, instead of doing an invert select, let's say there were multiple surfaces on this object, and I just wanted to select whatever was left over. Well, if I go to my polygon statistics by hitting the W key, it will show me how many polygons are in my object and what they're called. Well, right now I have 4 that are called fronts, and everything else is called sides. Well, it's called sides because I had already surfaced it earlier, but if I hadn't, it would be called default. And I would know that this is everything left over that I haven't surfaced yet. So if I hit the plus button in the column that says with surface, it's going to highlight all of the polygons with the surface that's selected in the pop-up menu, or side. So when I hit the plus button, it highlights all the surfaces. But it did not deselect the polygons that were selected for the front. So in order to make this work, I would have to deselect first, go to my statistics window, and select just those polys. I now have the polygons selected for the sides and the back. So, one of the most important things to remember when you're modeling something, if you're modeling something in the real world that you can actually physically hold on to, go ahead and get it. I actually modeled a fork at one point, and I sent it over to my colleague Brad Peebler, and he looked at it and he said, "Don, did you look at that fork when you modeled it?" And I said, "No, I did it off the top of my head." And he said, "Why don't you go look at a fork?" I went and I looked at a fork, and I realized all the mistakes I made just by holding the fork in my hand. So it's very important that if you can look at the object, look at it, measure it, make it to scale. Another mistake that's made often is I'll make a desk, and then I'll make a lamp to put on top of the desk, and when I try and put the two together, I find out that the lamp is bigger than the whole house that the desk is sitting in. Well, this is because I did not model things to scale. Now, I can go in and fix it. I can scale and size the objects within the modeler, but you're just much better off if you're making things to scale from the get-go and you don't have these problems later on down the road. So the first thing I want to make is a plate. I'm going to start out by creating my own polygon. And what you want to do is you want to look at the profile of the object. And seeing as how a plate is symmetrical, I can draw out the profile of what the plate looks like when I'm looking at it on its side flat, and then I can use a tool called Lathe to lathe that polygon around. So how do I make the original polygon? Well, I go to the polygon menu and I click on Create Points. Now when I'm going to create points, if I hold down the left mouse button, now again, I'm going to look at the face view because I'm looking at it from its side. So looking at the face view, with the left mouse button, it gives me a crosshair. And then in order to create the point, I hit the Enter key. A shortcut to that is use the right mouse button to place your point, and as soon as you let go of the right mouse button, the point gets placed, just like you hit the Enter key. Of course, this can also cause you problems if you start doing a bunch of clicks that you don't mean to do. You're going to be placing points in those spots. So this may be a technique you might want to use after you get used to placing points by using the Enter key. So I've got one point right here on the y-axis in the center, and this is where the center of my plate is going to be. And then I'm going to come out here to the edge. Let's see, we got about out to here is where I'm going to start the curve up of the plate. Now I want to zoom in on that area. So if I put the cursor over the area I want to zoom in on and I hit the G key, it centers it, and I zoom in a little bit on it. Okay, now this is the inside of the top of the plate. So now the plate's going to raise up a little bit, and then I'm going to raise it up a little bit more, about up to there. Now this is where it might get a little bit tricky because I want to make the rounded edge come around and fill in the bottom of the plate. So I'm going to zoom way in on this area, and I'm going to put a point about here and a point, oops, I made a couple extra ones there. I can use the undo key to get rid of them. A point about here, and then I'm going to come one down there and one back up in here, creating a little lip. It's going to come around. Now I can go back out and say, all right, then I want the plate to come down to here. Let's zoom in on that. Let me undo that one. use my arrow keys. So I want it to come down to there and then down to here, but I also want to create a little lip for the plate to sit on at the bottom here. So what I'm going to do is zoom in on this area, put one point down here and one point up here, and this is going to create a little bit of a lip. Now I can come over and place my last point right here, and if I hit the P key, it will make the polygon. Now, by looking at this, I don't think I've created a big enough lip over here, so I can go and modify it. So let's zoom in on that area, hit the G key and zoom in on it, and let's just grab these points by lassoing them. Let's pull them down a little bit. Pull them down and out a little bit. It's going to make a little bit of a bigger lip for me. Now I'll just grab these 2 points and pull them out a little bit further. Again, increasing that lip that's going to be made there. Now I can use the drag tool to individually drag some points around and tweak this a little bit better. Put that one there. We'll put this one out there. Something along those lines. Still pretty small lip. Let's fix this one over here. I'm going to zoom in on it, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all of these points and move them up until this line straightens out. Now I know I have a straight line going back and forth. Okay, I still think I want to make this a little bit bigger, so let's just select all these points and size them up a little bit. And there we go. I now have my flat polygon. That's a profile of my plate. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I need to make sure that it's resting right on the crosshairs here. I'll use the move tool, T for move. I'll hold down the control key to constrain, so I'm just moving up. And now it's right on that center axis. Or at least I think it is. It might not be. Now I have grid snap turned on, so more than likely it is. But if it wasn't, if I wanted to make sure that this was right dead on that axis, I could select just those points that I want to be on the axis, go to the Tools menu, and use a tool called Set Value. And Set Value is going to set them to an axis for me, and I want to set them to the x-axis. Now I know they're dead center right in the middle for me. Now I'm ready to lathe. The Lathe tool allows me to lay down an axis, and then it will take that single polygon and lathe it around that axis. Just like I had a piece of wood on a wood lathe, if I touch it in one place, that action is created all the way around the circumference of that piece of wood. So I'm going to go lathe. Now again, which way do I want to lathe it? I want to put my axis down here in the top view. Okay? If I lathe it down in the face view, it's going to try and lathe the plate around this way. If I try and lathe it here, it's going to try and lathe that around that way. No, I want to put it here and lathe this around this way. So now I can go to numeric before I lathe it and see that it's going to be made out of 24 sides. Well, I want it a little bit smoother than that. Let's make it out of 36 sides. And it's going to go from 0 to 360 all the way around. That's what I want. So by hitting the Enter key, it now makes it for me. And we can see the plate that I've created. I've got the little lip on the edge that I wanted. I've got the little lip underneath here that I wanted. I can go ahead and turn smoothing on to smooth out some of the edges. And you can see that I have a plate made from a single polygon. Another thing that you can do to make sure that you're getting your size set right is use a reference object. A lot of times I'll have objects in Lightwave that I know are made to scale. So I'll load one of them into the background window and I'll use it as a reference. I can use it as a sizing reference. For instance, I already have a plate made, so if I load the plate object, here it is, I can now go to another layer and see the plate in the background layer. Now I can use this as a reference to make my fork and my knife and my spoon because I see how big it is. I'm not saying you don't want to measure the fork and the knife and the spoon, because you do. But if for some reason you don't have that option available to you, this is a great way of sizing and scaling your objects to get them pretty close. Now if I do have a reference object like this and I want to make a copy of it, or I want to make a plate that's my own but in the same shape and size of this, I can simply use this as my template for making my polygon. I can zoom in a little bit on this side, and I can start making points. Let's go to polygon point. And I can put one down here, and then one over here, then one up here, then one over here, one out there, and one down here. And I'm just making my way around. Come down to here, down to there, and back up into there, and over to there. Now, using that as a tracer is very easy for me to plot those points. I hit the P key to make my polygon. There it is. Doesn't look like a whole lot, but again, I want to put that on the center line. Make sure it's right there, and multiply and lathe it. Again, putting my cursor in the top view to do my lathe. And here's the copy of the plate that I just made, and it's pretty close. I could go in and tweak it. So using reference objects makes it very easy, not only to model objects that are similar, but also for you to learn the concepts of how they were modeled. Now I want to model a ashtray. Now, granted, not too many people are smoking at dinner anymore, but I want to model an ashtray because it'll show you some new techniques that we haven't taken a look at yet. So let's bring our plate up in the background so we can kind of eyeball how big we want the ashtray to be. And the ashtray is probably going to be about the size of the inner portion of the plate here. So I'm going to use an object like a disc. And when I drag a disc out, I don't have to make it perfectly round. I can make it kind of oblong, and I'm going to because I want my ashtray to be kind of an oblong shape. And I'll give it some depth, and I'll make it. So here's the starting point for my ashtray. I'm going to go ahead and surface it. Right now, this is surfaced as stripe because stripe was the last thing that I surfaced. Now when I start creating my next model, it's going to retain that same surface. So when you start modeling your next object, remember to go into the surface panel and change its name to whatever the new object is. We'll call this ashtray. And I'll just pick a default color for now, just while we're making it. So here's the ashtray. Now, there's a couple of different ways I can do this. I want to sink this polygon down. I need a spot in here to be tapping my ashes into. So what I could do is, let me go ahead and get rid of the plate for now. We'll just work on the ashtray. First, I'm going to center the ashtray. And I could select the top polygon, and I could use the bevel tool. Now, the bevel tool traditionally does two things. It shrinks polygons down, and it moves them up, creating a bevel. Shrinking down and moving up creates that side bevel that I'm looking for. But the great thing about the bevel tool in Lightwave is that it allows you to do both of those actions independent of each other. So I can either shrink polygons down and create new polygons as I'm shrinking them, or I can move polygons and create new polygons as I'm moving them. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to take this top polygon, and I'm going to hit B for bevel, and I want to do an inset. Inset shrinks, shift moves. So I want to shrink this polygon down first. And if I look at my grid, it's 50 millimeters. Each one of these squares is 50 millimeters. Well, I'm going to shrink it down about, I don't know, a third of a grid square. Let's say about 20 millimeters. So I'll type in 20 millimeters on the inset, 0 on everything else. And it shrunk that polygon in and created new polygons for where it shrunk it in. Didn't really change the look of it yet, but it's given me more polygons to manipulate and play with here. Now I'm going to use the bevel tool again. I still have that inner polygon highlighted. Bevel. This time I don't want to shrink it. 0 on the inset. I want to move it down. And I'm going to move it down, let's say 30 millimeters. So negative 30 millimeters because I'm sucking it into the object, not pushing it away from the object. And there's my area now that I can tap my ashes into. But I'm going to need an area to put the cigarettes, so I can use a Boolean for that. I'll go to a new layer, and I'll bring the ashtray up in the background layer. And I'm going to use a disk as my cutting tool. So looking from the side or the face view here, I want to cut a disk out so that only half of the disk sinks into the object. This is where I'm going to be laying my cigarette. Now I'll make sure that it cuts all the way through both sides of the object. And there's my first Boolean cutting tool. Now, I want to have another one going long ways because I want 2 cigarette holds here, 2 cigarette holds on these sides. Instead of making a new object, what I'm going to do is select a couple of polygons on this one, close bracket key, select connected. I select all the connected polygons. Now I'm going to copy it by hitting C on the keyboard, and I'm going to paste it right back on top of itself by hitting V. I now have a copy of it selected right on top of the old one. Now I can go to rotate, And if I put my rotation cursor right in the middle and hold the control key, this constrains me to 15-degree snaps as I rotate it. So it's very easy for me to come down and rotate it exactly 90 degrees. But it's not long enough. It's not going through the ends of the ashtray. Well, let's select these points, hit T for move, hold down the control key, and drag it out. Deselect those and do the same thing to the other side. Select these points, T for move, hold down control to constrain it, make sure it goes all the way through. Now I have my cutting tool. I'm going to swap my layers by hitting the apostrophe key. The apostrophe key will take anything that's in the foreground layer and put it in the background, anything that's in the background and put it in the foreground. So now my cutting tools are in the background, which is where they need to be for a Boolean. What I'm cutting is in the foreground, and I'm ready to do that Boolean. Booleans are located in the Tools menu, or Shift-B is your keyboard shortcut. And they default to subtract, because probably about 90% of the Boolean functions that I do are subtractions. I hit OK, and it cuts away the edges where my cigarettes are going to go. Now this looks okay, but there's a problem with this ashtray. There's a big problem with it if you ask me. And that is it looks really computery. It looks really artificial. And one of the reasons it looks really artificial is because all of the edges on it are 90-degree angles. It's really, really sharp edges everywhere I look on it. And it doesn't look real at all. So I need to have a way of making it a little bit more organic. So let me undo all the way back to the point where I made the disk. So I now have my disk, and I haven't shrunk this polygon down. Instead of shrinking the polygon down this time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Boolean to cut that area away. And instead of being straight in and straight down with hard edges, I'm going to use a ball to cut that area away. So I'll bring it up in the background, go to Objects, and I'll choose the Ball tool. Again, placing my cursor right in the center of the top view, I can drag out the circumference of the ball, and I'll make it a little bit smaller than the ashtray. And then in the side view here, when I drag it up, then I'm going to grab it by the crosshair and drag this up, and I can see what's going to get cut away. I'm going to cut away this section, and it's going to be rounded as it gets cut away. So let's make this as our cutting tool. Again, I'll use the apostrophe key to swap my layers, Shift-B for a Boolean subtract, and you can see now that I get a nice curved area on the inside of the ashtray. It looks much, much more realistic and much nicer, more pleasant to the eye. Now I can do that same Boolean trick again. Put it up in the background. I'll use a disk. And I want to cut my cigarette holder right there. Make sure it cuts all the way through. And instead of having to elongate it after I copy it, I'm going to make it extra long so that when I rotate it, I know it goes all the way through the sides here. So let's make this as our first one. Touch it, do a select connected, C for copy, V for paste, Y for rotate. Put my cursor right in the middle and hold down the control key and spin that one around. I'll hit the apostrophe key to swap my layers again and Shift-B. And I have a much better looking ashtray now, much more organic in nature because it's curved here. And again, instead of making a disk as my primitive object, I could have made a profile polygon for what my ashtray was going to look like and then lathe that around and then put the cigarette holes in it to get even more of an organic type shape. So there's a couple of ways to make the ashtray. Now one thing I want to tell you about Booleans as well is this. I'm going to undo back to the point where I'm going to do my Boolean. But before I swap my layers to do it, I'm going to select my cutting tool. And I'm going to surface it and call it Cut 1. And I'm going to give it a surface color. And apply it to the whole thing. Okay, now I'll swap my layers and do my Boolean. And when I do, you'll notice that the surface of the cutting tool is left behind on the object that it cuts away. This allows me to do very intricate surfacing procedures at the same time that I'm doing the Boolean. If I'm doing a very intricate Boolean that's going to cut out a very organic or intricate shape in an object, then I'm going to want to go in and surface that intricate shape that I just cut out. I can do that whole thing in one shot. Just surface your cutting tool with the surface name, because right now the inner part of the ashtray is called Cut 1. I probably don't want that. So when I was making the cutting tool to make the inside of the ashtray, I would probably call it inner ashtray. That way, when I cut it out, the inside of my ashtray is not only surfaced the way I want it to be, but it's also called inner ashtray. Okay, let's go ahead and clear that out, and let's try and make the table that we're going to do our place setting on. Now, to make the table, I want to try and be able to visualize that I'm going to want a table that's, oh, let's say 6 feet across. And it's going to be a round table. So, do I make a disc? No, I'm going to make my polygons. But I need to be able to make sure that I'm making it basically 2 meters or 6 feet across. So again, if I look at my grid right here, it's 500 millimeters. So each 2 blocks is 1 meter. So if I make what I'm going to do is I am going to make a disc. Out 2 and out 2. And we can bring this side in a little bit. Let's move this over and center it up. Bring that out. Bring those up. That looks good. And I'll just give it a little bit of depth and I'll make it. Now this is not going to be part of my table at all. I'm going to use this as a reference to make my table. Now if I go to a new layer and I bring it up in the background, I can use it as a reference point for the length of the table. And I know that I want half of my table to be from this center line out to here, and then when I lathe it around, I'll get my 2 meter circumference. So I want to make my table. I'll go back to points, go to polygon, create points, and first I'm going to put a point here. Then I'm going to come out to the edge of the table and put a point here. Now I'm going to zoom in on that area a little bit because I want to add some detail. So at the edge of the table, now I want it to come out a little bit with a little bit of a bevel, then down, let's say down to about here. Then I'll put one in and down again to create a little bit of a lip or a bevel. We'll bring this into about here, back up to about here, and then I zoom back out. Again, I can expand my face view by hitting the number 1 key. See a lot more of what I'm working with. Now I just want to put a point right there. And it's not letting me get it right where I want it to be. I'm going to undo that point. It's because of my grid snap. If I zoom in one more time, move this over, should be able to get it exactly. And there it is. Now I've got my polygon made, and I can see already that I want this to have a little bit more depth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these bottom points here, make up the bottom part of the outside of the table. We'll hit T for move, Control, and we'll drag them down, which just elongates the side of the table. Now we hit P. Now if I've done another operation, now I hit P, hey, it didn't make a polygon. Well, that's because it doesn't know what order the points are in. It's very important that the points be in the proper order so it knows how to connect the lines to make the polygon. If you run into this situation, you have to reselect your points, and they must be selected in order. So I go to the point mode, click in a gray area, and I start out with this one. Then I select the next one after that, and you're playing connect the dots here. Come down here and select that one, the next one after that, this inner one, back up into here, and then back here for the last one. Now when I hit P, it makes the polygon for me. Let's go ahead and lathe it. I'll go back to my quad view. Let's go to multiply. Always remember to deselect any points before you do a lathe or a mirror. Otherwise, it's just going to try and lathe or mirror just those points that are selected. So make sure nothing is selected, so everything is selected, and we can do our lathe. Multiply, lathe. Again, put this down right in the top, and enter. So there's my tabletop. Now I want to make some legs. So I'll go to a new layer, and I'll bring up the table in the background so I can see it, use it as a reference point. And we'll hit the A key, which enlarges it in this window. Use the arrow keys to move up a little bit, and let's make the legs. We're going to do our create our own polygon trick again. So let's go ahead and start with a point right here at the bottom of the table. And we're going to come down to here. We're going to come down to here. And then to here. Out just a little further. Then I'm going to kind of work my way around here. give it a nice flat bottom where it's going to actually sit, and then come back up to about here and hit P. Let's just go ahead and extrude it. I'll go to Multiply, Extrude. When I click in the front face of it again, just like with the text, I get a handle here. How far am I going to extrude it? I'll extrude it about that far. And here is one leg for my table. Now, I can position it by hitting the T key, moving it around, getting it into the position that I want it. Okay, and again, I can blow this view up and zoom in and get a little more control over how I'm moving it. That looks good. Let's go back to our quad view and hit the A key. Now I want 4 legs. Well, we'll use the mirror tool. Now if I lay the mirror tool right down on the axis, not only is it going to duplicate the leg over to here, it's going to mirror it, but it's also going to duplicate this space. So this leg will be perfectly spaced from the center, just like this one is. So now I've got 2 legs. Well, now I want 2 legs going this way. How am I going to mirror those? Well, I'm not. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the polygon mode, and in my left view here, I'm going to lasso the whole thing, both of them. And I'm going to use the copy-paste technique. Let's hit C on the keyboard for copy, V for paste, hit Y for rotate. Again, I'm going to put the cursor right in the center of the screen, hold down the Control key to constrain it to 15-degree increments, and I can rotate my copies right around into position. So let's see, now we've got the plate, we've got the ashtray, and we've got the table. Let's go ahead and try and finish the table setting. Let's make a knife, a spoon, and a fork. I'm going to load up the plate. Why? Because I'm going to use it as a reference. So let's grab the plate, hit the A key. Now I'm going to use this as a reference for size for how big I'm going to make the knife, the fork, and the spoon. Again, if you can actually measure the knife and the fork and the spoon, you're much better off. You're also much better off if you physically have a knife, a fork, or a spoon to look at before you start modeling them. So I'm going to make the fork first, and I'm going to take a good look at this fork, and if you look at it, you see that it's got some pretty serious curves going on, and if you look at it from this way, it's also got some pretty organic shaped curves going on this way. So you have to look at it from the top, look at it from the side, look at it from the front, just like you would look at it in the modeler, and then you've got an idea of where you can start. Now, with something like the fork, go to a fresh layer and bring that one up in the background. I want to start with a box. So I'm going to go to Object, Box. And I'm going to draw it out. My fork's probably going to be about that long. So now I'm just going to go to the layer that's got the fork in it, or the box for the template of the fork. Let's give it some depth. And I need to start thinking about, I'm going to make a fork. It's going to have 4 prongs on it. Well, the way I'm going to get those prongs is by beveling polygons out. So I need to have extra polygons in here so that I can bevel them out. So in this top view, I'm going to add segments. I'm going to add enough segments to where if I select these polygons, I've got 1 fork here, I skip 1 fork here, I skip 1 fork here, I skip 1, and 1 fork there. That's perfect. That's what I need. I can probably thin this out, make it a little bit more square, and create that box. Now, all I have so far is a box. Now, looking at the fork, the first thing that I want to do is I want to get this kind of curve in here. Okay? I need to have extra polygons if I'm going to bend an object. To be able to bend an object, it has to have polygons. If I try and take this object as it sits right now, and I go to Modify Bend, and I grab it from the end like I told you about before, so we can try and bend it up like this, and I try and bend it, it doesn't bend. There's no extra geometry in there for me to bend it. There's only these points and those points. Let me undo that. I need extra geometry in here. So I could have made it when I created it, but if I would have, it would have given me equal sections all the way down the whole length of the fork. And I don't want that either. I just want a bunch of extra sections up here at the top. So I can use a new 5.5 tool called the Knife tool. I'm going to zoom in on this area. And I'm just going to, with the left mouse button, click once, drag it across, and then right mouse button, knifes it. And when I do that, I end up with a new set of polygons there and a new set of points. So now I can just start drawing in new sets. Put one here, one here, one here. And it doesn't matter if they're perfectly straight. Sometimes it might, but for this kind of a fork object, they could even be a little crooked. It doesn't make that big of a difference. So I'll drag out and get a bunch of extra polygons here at the end. Now I'm going to select those polygons by lassoing them. And if I hit the A key, I can see that I've got these extra polygons at the end, and they are now selected. I'm going to use one of my modify tools, the shear tool. And if you remember before, when I sheared something from the top, it kind of sheared it over, like italicizing it. Well, I'm going to use one of my preset shear modifiers, which is an S-curve, and grab it right on the top, hold down the control key to constrain it, and when I pull it down, I get that kind of curve that I have on my fork here. It's a good start. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these polygons. And I'm going to use the stretch tool. Let's zoom in on this area. Put my cursor right in the middle, hold down control, and stretch these together. Starting to look like a fork already. Now let's go ahead and grab these polygons. These are going to be the forks of the fork. Once I have them selected, I'm going to deselect every other one. And we go to the bevel tool. Now, looking at my grid, it's 10 millimeters. Each one of these is 10 millimeters. So on bevel, I'm going to shrink it down maybe 1 millimeter each time. And I want to push it out, let's see, 10, 20, 30, let's say 20 millimeters at a shot. So there's my first bevel, and I'll just hit bevel again, do that again. There's my second. Well, I don't like that. They're already getting way too thin. I'm going to undo this, go back to bevel, and I'm going to make this 0.5 millimeters. And you'll notice that when I hit enter, it converts it into nanometers for me automatically, which is kind of nice. And I'm going to go with 40 millimeters on the shift. So it pushes it out 40, shrinks it down half a millimeter. Let's back out a little bit. Okay, there's my first one. And if I think it's too far, again, I can just grab the move tool, hold down control, and I can bring this back to wherever I want it to be. Now I'll do one more bevel. And there's the forks of my fork. Now, one thing about this is it's still very rounded. Now, I have smoothing turned on. Let me turn smoothing off so we can see the polygons as they actually exist. So this is very polygonal object, very squared, rounded edges. A couple things I can do here. First of all, I want to have this kind of curve up. On this fork, it comes down, but then curves back up here at the end. Well, I need a couple of more segments here. I could have made my bevel smaller, and that would have given me the extra segments, but the knife tool sure comes in handy. So let's go ahead and knife some polys in here, and knife some polys in here. Now, I'm going to select all of these points. Oops, I got an extra one, deselect it. And I'm going to hit the move tool and move them up a little bit. Now I'm going to hit the space bar to get me back into the point mode and deselect these two. Hit the T key, control, bring that up a little. Hit the space bar, deselect these two. Hit the T key, control, move those up a little. And space bar, deselect, T key, control, move that up. And there's the curve on the fork that I was looking for. I didn't bend them, I didn't shear them, I just moved the points to create my curve. You don't always have to use a modification tool to get what you want. A lot of times you can get what you want just by manipulating the points and the polygons manually. Okay, and I'm still looking at this going, yeah, well, it looks okay, but not real good. Well, there's a tool in Lightwave Modeler called Metaform. And what Metaform will do is it will take all the hard edges of your objects and it will smooth them out. It will create a much more organic shape. Metaform is a form of subdivision, so if you go to Polygon Subdivide, you'll see that Metaform is here. When you click on Metaform, it will tell you that you can change the max smoothing angle. That's a variable. Leave it at 179. It's fine. And hit OK. And when I do, it smooths my fork out quite a bit. Gives me nice round edges. Maybe I want to smooth it even more than that. Well, let's Metaform it again. Shift D is my keyboard shortcut. Now it's even more organic looking, and it's starting to look pretty good. It's starting to look like a fork, although they're all coming straight out. And a fork generally tapers in a little bit as you get to the top. So we'll undo back to our polygonal model, and let's select the polygons, polygon mode, that make up the forks. Just those. I'll go to Modify Taper, and from the front view here, again, hold down Control. Watching the top view, I taper them in a little bit, just a little bit. That looks pretty good. Now I'm ready to metaform again. Shift D, okay. Shift D, okay. Not bad. Okay, they're a little pointy, but I could put a little extra polygon at the end of those to make them less round, make them more flat. If I come down here with my knife tool, and I knife in a section right at the end here. Let's zoom in on that. I now have extra polygons just at the tips of the forks, and when I metaform now, you'll see that they stay a lot more rounded at the ends instead of being flattened out or coming to a point like they would if I was using metaform without that extra geometry at the end. Okay, that looks better, but if I look at the body of the fork, it's straight. Well, if I look at the body of this fork, it definitely has a bend to it. What I can do is use the knife tool. Let's take the knife and let's knife a section right here. I now have these points that in the side view I can grab, hit the T key, and let's move those up a little bit. Maybe back like this. That's probably too much. Let's do something like that. Just a little bit of a bend in there, and the end of the fork is just this wide, flat thing. I don't want that. I want it to kind of round off like the bottom of this fork kind of rounds off. So to do that, I'll go ahead and use my knife tool to knife in an extra polygon towards the end here. Zoom in on this area. Let's grab these points and use the stretch tool. Put our cursor right in the center and stretch these together. This rounds off the edge for me nicely. Okay, let's hit the A key. We've deselected all our points, and we metaform it twice. And we end up with a pretty decent replica of my fork. Okay, now we have the fork done, and I want to make the knife. The knife is infinitely more simple than the fork, but the first thing I want to do is I want to look at a knife. Okay, get the general shape, look at it from all the different views, and I can compare it to the fork to get a general idea how much bigger than it needs to be. Once I've done that, I can go to a new layer, and let's bring our fork up in the background layer. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit, and I'm going to start again with a box. So we can make it almost the same size, just longer than the fork. And I don't need all these extra segments that I have in there. First of all, let's give it a little bit of depth in this window. Let's zoom in a little bit on this now. And let's get rid of all these extra segments. I don't need them. Make it. Okay. I'm going to undo that. I want it to be a little bit wider. About like that should work. Make it. And I'm now going to show you a technique called MetaNurbs. MetaNurbs is different than Metaform in that MetaNurbs is real-time interactive metaform. It allows me to see what the object is going to look like in its smooth shape, just like after it's been metaformed, while I'm working on it, while it's still in polygons. And I can manipulate points and polygons and see the smooth shape as I'm creating the object. So let's take a look at how this works. We'll hit the A key, we'll take a look. Let's go ahead and center it up. It's always a good idea to center things up. There we go. Hit the A key again so we can see what we're dealing with. And I need to make this knife. So I'm looking at it from my top view. Here's my top view. And I want to get the basic shape that I have going on here. Well, again, I'm going to go in, I'm going to use my knife tool, and I'm going to start cutting in polygons where I need them. Well, I need to bring the top here together a little bit. So let's cut an extra polygon in there. Let's grab these 2 points, use the stretch tool, and actually, let's deselect these. Let's just use the move tool and move this in a little bit, making the rounded edge the front of the knife. It doesn't look like much there, but when I turn on MetaNurbs by hitting the Tab key, I can see that I'm rounding off the edge of the knife up at this edge. Now I can move these points by going to drag, modify drag. Move this one down, move this one in a little bit. I want it to be a little bit more rounded. So maybe what I'm going to do is move these 2 points closer together, move this one up and out a little bit. Right, that's good for now. Go to the knife tool, knife in another section about here. Then another section about here. Okay, now we'll go back to the drag mode and let's pull this out a little bit. Let's take this point and move it way in. This is going to begin to create the blade for me. So now I've got the points that are making up the blade. And I can just drag these points around in real time and see what it looks like as I'm making it. Okay, that looks okay for a start. Now I'm going to go ahead and I need to make this into a blade. It's all the same thickness right now. So if I look at the knife from this angle, I can see that the whole blade thins out. The whole blade is the same thickness, and the handle comes up and stays pretty much the same thickness. So all I need to do is grab the points that are making up the blade right now, which would be all of these points. And I'm going to zoom in my left-hand view here. I'm going to hit the G key and zoom in and see what I'm working with. Let's go ahead and just look at the left-hand view and use my stretch tool, hold down Control, put it in the center, and stretch these points together so that they're almost touching. And it thins the blade of the knife out nicely. Let's go back, take a look. Yes, thin that blade out nicely for me. Now I might want to make some more modifications. Maybe I will deselect my points, go back to my knife tool, and let's knife another section in here. And this really solidifies the handle for me. The more geometry that I add with MetaNurbs, the less smoothing and rounding it gets to do. So I can add detail by adding extra geometry. I can now definitely see the handle and the blade of the knife, and it's coming along. The knife is a very simple object. I might want to put a little bit of detail onto the handle of the knife. One of the nice things is I can go back to the polygonal mode with MetaNurbs at any time just by hitting the Tab key. And this is what I've modeled so far. What if I want to put some detail on the handle? Well, in this view, I'm going to go ahead to the polygon mode, and I'm going to select the top and the bottom polygons of the handle, and let's zoom in on that a little bit, and deselect the side ones. I just want the top and the bottom. I can look in this window and see that I just have 2 polygons selected, so I know I only have the top and the bottom, and I'm going back to my bevel tool. This time I want to shrink them down in. I can see that my grid is set to 20 millimeters. Each one of these squares is 20, so let's shrink it about 5 millimeters on the inset. 0 on the shift. And I've created a new polygon now inside the old one. And I'm going to take that polygon with my stretch tool, and I'm going to stretch it into the shape that I want it to be. And because I'm stretching in this view, when I stretch the top one, the bottom one automatically stretches because I'm going straight through the knife, and I had both polygons selected when I was doing the stretch. Now, I'm going to use the bevel tool again, and this time we'll go ahead and pop that out, let's say 2 millimeters, just a little bit. So what I've done is I've just added an extra little bit of detail on the handle here, and if we go and hit the Tab, deselect and hit the Tab key, you can see that I get a nice little accent on the handle of my knife there. Little hand grip. And that looks pretty good. Hit the A key, and I can see what the knife looks like. Now, this is a NURBed object. I cannot load a MetaNurbs object into the layout. It must be polygons before I can load it into the layout. So to make this into polygons, I use the Freeze tool. Go to the Tool panel, and I can click on Freeze. And when I do, this gets made out of a lot of polygons. If I use the W key, my polygon statistics, I can see that it's 1,368 polygons. That's a lot of polygons, especially for a very simple object like this. So I'm going to undo that, And as I described in the beginning of the tape, in the options panel, hit O, we have this number here, the patch division number. And when I described it earlier, I talked about it modifying the way that your preview looked in OpenGL. But this is also the number that determines how many polygons are going to be used to create the object when I freeze it. And the way that it works is for each single polygon that exists on this knife right here, if I have this set to 6, it's going to create a 6 by 6 grid for every single polygon, or 36 polygons for every polygon. That's a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that number down to 4 and freeze it. The knife still looks just like it did before, no different. But now I'm down to 608 polygons, a massive reduction. This is key if I want to keep my rendering times low and I want to be able to move objects around easily within layout and within modeler, because the more polygons you have, the more it will slow your OpenGL down. Now, if you have a good OpenGL card in your machine, that's not going to be too much of an issue with a polygon counts like this. But with no OpenGL card in your machine, it's going to make a big difference. So, if I wanted to, I could undo that, go to the patch division, let's make it 3. Still looks good. 342 polygons. So we're really getting that number down there now. And that looks pretty good. That's probably what I would save out and use as my knife object. All right, let's create the spoon. So let's go ahead and go to a new layer, bring the fork up in the background layer, and we're going to make a box. Let's go ahead and make the box about the size of the handle of the fork. Give it some depth. And we'll make it. And we'll just go to the layer that's got the spoon to be in it, and let's start making the spoon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this front polygon right here, zoom in on it a little bit, and we're going to bevel it out. My grid's 10 millimeters, so I'm going to bevel it out, let's say 40 millimeters on the shift. This gives me the area that's going to become the spoon. If that's not far enough, again, I can hit T and kind of move that out a little bit. That looks good. Now, I need to make the hollowed out area that's going to become the spoon itself. So to do that, I select the top and the bottom polygons of this area of the spoon, just the top and just the bottom, and I shrink them in. So let's shrink them in 10 millimeters on the inset, 0 on the shift. It creates new polygons inside connected to the old ones. I can use my stretch tool to stretch these into kind of a square shape like this. And then from this view over here, I'm going to use the move tool to pull them down a little bit. This starts to create the spoon area for me. Maybe just a little bit more than that, something along those lines. It starts to create the spoon area for me. Now, if I turn MetaNurbs on, I have to remember to deselect any selected polygons before I turn NURBS on. If I don't, I'm only going to NURB the polygons that are selected and not the rest of them. So it's very important. Whenever I'm going to NURB or UNNURB an object, remember to deselect all those polygons. Now I'm going to turn NURBS on, and I can see the spoon starting to take shape. Although, see how blocky it is around here? That's that patch division number. So while I'm modeling, I like to keep that at 6. So I can see a nice smooth version of what I'm working on. And that's great. Okay. Now I need to have a little bit wider area up here for the spoon. So back to our knife tool. Let's go ahead and knife a section right across the middle here. Let's grab those points. And I'm just going to grab the outside points, if you notice that, not the inside points, and stretch them apart. Okay, these top points, I'm going to grab those, and I'm going to stretch them together. And these bottom points, we're going to stretch them together as well. This starts to form the spoon for me a little bit. I need to knife in some new polygons. Knife and knife some in here. You can see all of them. That dramatically shortens up the curvature that I had going on, helping me make the spoon. And again, I can grab those points and stretch them together. Starts to look better. And I can take the points at the top of the spoon. Let's stretch those out a little bit to kind of elongate it like a spoon would be. That's looking pretty good. Okay, now I look at the whole thing, and again, the end here, what I'm going to do is knife in a section towards the end, and then take these 2 points at the end and stretch them together. This rounds off the end for me nicely. When I look at it from the side, it's absolutely straight and flat at this point, so what I'm going to do, knife in a section here, grab those points, move them up to give myself a little bit of a curve there. I might even want to take these points and move them up a little bit, kind of like that. And I want this spoon part to curve up a little bit, but instead of moving them manually, what I'm going to do is select all the points here that are making up the end of the spoon, hit Y for rotate, and put my cursor here. Let me blow this up a little bit for you. If I put my cursor here and I rotate, I can rotate them all up, giving me that curve. That might be a little bit too much of a curve. Let's go with something like that. Hit the A key, and there's my spoon. And it looks pretty good. But again, this is MetaNurbs. I need to make it into polygons. You have to remember when you're ready to save your object to freeze it. Wow, I'm at the patch division of 6. That's too many polys, so let's undo that. Turn our patch division down. I made the other one a patch division of 3, so I'll use the same one for this. There's my spoon. Now I can see the polygons, but if I simply turn smoothing on, it looks just like it did when it was in MetaNurbs. Pretty good looking spoon. Whenever I work with NURBS, before I save the final object, I save the object as a NURBS object. I can save a MetaNurbs object and reload it into Modeler. So I'll save the object as a NURBS object, and I'll put a little extension on the end of it. I would say spoon.n.lwo. The N tells me it's NURBS, and LWO for Lightwave object. Whenever I want to make a modification to the spoon, let's say I take the spoon in and I'm working with it in its polygonal form, and I say, hey, that's not quite right. When I come back to the modeler, I can reload the NURBS version of that object and modify the NURBS version. If I freeze an object into polygons, and then I bring that back in, there's no way that I can un-NURB it. There's no way that I can make it back into NURBS once it's frozen. So you want to save the NURB version, and you want to save the polygonal version. Which brings up another good point, and that is to save often and save early. As you're creating your object, as you're working through it, save it off as spoon 1, and then save off maybe 3 or 4 steps down as spoon 2, spoon 3, spoon 4, so on until you end up with the final. That way, if the machine should have a problem, you should have a crash or a power outage, something along those lines, you don't lose hours worth of work. You may want to make sure that you save early and often, and then once you have your final object, you can get rid of the earlier versions. But a lot of times it's even nice to have those earlier versions, because if you do decide to make a modification, you can just start where you're halfway done making the spoon and make modifications from that point on. So saving several versions of your objects, both NURBS and polygonal, is a really good idea. Okay, let's take a look at one more modeling technique, and that's spline-based modeling. I'm going to go ahead and make a vase that's going to sit on our table. So I'm going to load up the table object, and I want to put a vase in the center of it. I'll go to another layer and bring it up in the background. And I'm going to use my arrow keys to move this view down a little bit. And actually, let's go ahead and expand this view and zoom in even more. So I want to have a vase sitting in the center of the table here. Well, with spline-based modeling, I can use my sketch tool and I can draw out a freehand shape. So let's say something like this. And I hit enter and it makes a spline or a curve with some lines on it. Now what I tried to do was draw out the profile of the vase, or just the beginning of the profile of the vase. I can make a lot more modifications to it as I will. Let's go ahead back to our 4 quad screen view and hit the A key. You'll notice you don't see anything in the preview window. That's because splines don't render. I need to make this into polygons, and I can do that by lathing it. So I'm going to zoom in here. I need to make sure that this point is at 0, so I'm going to use set value because I want to lathe right around that point. I need to have it at the center, so we'll set value for X. You see it jump in there to the center. Now when I do my lathe, first I need to deselect the point, or it's just going to try and lathe that point. We'll go multiply lathe, lay our lathe tool here in the middle, and it lays that around into a vase object for me. So let's zoom in on this vase and take a little bit of a closer look at it. Well, that's not bad, but this object is 1 polygon thick. There is no depth to it. If I look at it from the side here, I can see that it's 1 polygon thick. Now, if it's going to be kind of far away from the camera, I can get away with that. But if I'm going to get close to it, I'm going to notice that it's 1 polygon thick. It's not going to look very nice. Well, first of all, polygons are one-sided by default, so if I didn't have double-sided turned on, it would have looked like this. And I wouldn't have been able to see the inside of it. So to solve that problem, we turn on double-sided, and now I can see the inside of it because I can see the polygons from both sides. But it's still very, very thin. So the way I'm going to fix that is I'm going to undo back to the spline, and I'm going to zoom in on this area of the spline in the face view, and I want to make this kind of curl over into a lip so it looks like it's three-dimensional. Well, I need to add some points to it. So I'm going to go to the polygon mode and select the spline, go to the polygon menu, add points, and I'm going to add 3 points, 3 extra points in there, maybe 4. What the heck. Now, let's go to Modify, Drag, and let's go to Points first and go to Drag. And let's zoom in on this even more. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to bring this over. And then I can grab this one and bring it down, grab this one and bring it around, and grab this last one and bring it around, and make a lip. And I want to make that lip so it almost matches up with the edge. Something like that. Now when I look at it, I've just got an extra little lip up here on the edge. Now when I lathe it, first of all, let's deselect any points, lathe, put our lathe axis here in the middle. Now I've got a nice little lip up at the top, and it really looks like it's got depth to it, even though it doesn't. It's a way of making an object appear to look 3D, yet saving a lot of extra polygons by not having to go down and create the inside layer and then come out and create the outside layer. Once I've created an object, I need to be able to save it. How do I save an object? Well, I come up to my Files pop-up, and I can do several things. If I just save the object, it's going to save the object over top of the last object saved. This is for if I'm working on an object and I save it with a name, and then I keep modifying it, resaving it over top of itself. Save As allows me to save the object for the first time and give it a name. Save As is also what I use if I want to send it to a different area, like if I want to send it to a floppy, or I want to send it to a different hard drive partition. When I go to Save As, up here I can pick what drive I'm going to save it to. I'm going to save it to where I was. And then down here, I give it a name. We'll call it vase. And since I already have a vase in here, I'm going to call it vase 2. Now, you always want to put .lwo on the end of it. If you have Lightwave 5.5 and Windows NT 4.0, it will put those extensions on for you automatically, but only if you have Lightwave 5.5 and Windows NT 4.0. Otherwise, you want to put LWO on the end of it so that it's recognized the next time you come into the requester. And I save the object. Now, if I modify this object, grab some points, let's say, and move these up, make it a little bit of a taller vase, now I could just save the object using Save Object, and it would save over top of the vase that I just saved. But it would also come up and ask me if I want to save over it. So there is a way out. It's not you've done it and there's nothing you can do about it. It gives you a requester to get out if you're not sure that's what you want to do. Another option is Save Layers As. So if I'm making an object like the table that was made in several different layers, I've got the table top, and I can select it, hit Select Connected, cut it, go to a new layer, and paste it. Now I've got the tabletop there. Then I go back and I select some polygons for the legs, select Connected, and I cut those, and I go to a different layer and I paste them. Now I've got the table in 3 layers. Here's the brace, here's the top, and here's the legs. And I may want to save it out as layers so that I could come back and just modify the legs without having to cut them out like I just did. To do that, you just come over and say Save Object or Save Layers As, but when I do that, it's going to save all of the layers that are currently in the modeler. So you don't want to have anything extraneous, like I still have the vase in here. It would have saved the vase as part of it. Hey, Maybe I want that. Maybe I want the tables here and the vase in this layer over here so I can work on both. Great, then I can go ahead and do it. But if I just want the table, make sure that's the only thing that's in there. It will also save things in the background layer. It will save it set up however you have the scene set up right now. If I set the scene up like this, where I've got two things in the background, one thing in a layer but not active at all, and one thing in the foreground, save as layers. When I reload this object, it will load just like this. Things in the background, things in the foreground, and everything there for me. Whenever I save a layered object, I would put the object's name .l.lwo, so I know it's layered. So a lot of times when I'm saving objects, I'm saving 3 versions minimum. I'm saving a polygonal version, I'm saving a NURBS version, and I'm saving a layered version. And then maybe multiple versions of that object as it was being built. So I could end up with 10, 15 objects for that one object. But this gives me a lot of flexibility to go back and make changes to these objects by saving them. And small polygon count objects like this don't take up much room on your hard drive, so don't worry about filling up your hard drive with objects unless they start getting into multiple thousands of polygons per object. Okay, I have these objects in here in layers, and I want you to realize that I've got the vase sitting right on the tabletop. If I save these objects out, they will save out in this position according to wherever the crosshairs are. When I load them into the layout, the vase will be positioned right on the top of the table like it is in layout. So when I'm making my objects in here, I may want to go ahead and position them so that they're sitting on top. I put the table settings down, the knife, the fork, and so forth. Save that whole thing, each object out as individuals, yet when I load them into the layout, the table will come in, the plate will load in right on top of the table where it should be, the fork and the knife and the spoon will come in, the vase will come in, and everything will already be positioned for me, ready to go. This is a nice technique and something to keep in mind, as well as the ground plane is right here. If I look at the table, the ground plane is right here. And the table is sitting so that the top of it is just touching the ground plane. That's probably not what I would want. I would probably want to move the table up so that its legs are resting on the ground. I hope you've enjoyed this tape as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.